Welcome to the lesson on protein and fiber. We will call protein and fiber the dynamic duo. They're partners in health largely because both of them can help us sustain fullness on less calories. We talked about calorie density, the calories per bite of food, and how food relates to the weight and calories, so that some foods have significantly more weight per calorie, thanks to water largely. And that concept of weight of food helps get us full, while protein and fiber may help keep us or sustain us full. And we'll also split up the two nutrients, protein and fiber, and discuss some of their individual contributions to health as well. But the reason that they're being held together is because of the concept that they work together in terms of sustaining fullness. So balancing them right, balancing them best, will help us with calorie balance in terms of staying full. This can result from the slower digestion that occurs thanks to both, the chewing factor that can occur in terms of many sources of both, and in terms of meal replacement shakes that are protein-rich, thick drinks. They can turn into semi-solids in the stomach and provide volume. And then both may also help in terms of lowering hunger hormones and hunger signaling. And therefore, when combined with calorie density, not to mention our hunger scale, which you'll see in a visual picture in a moment, putting them all together, can really help us be satisfied on far less calories. And that is a huge benefit to health and diabetes prevention, as well as much disease prevention. As I mentioned, we'll review, but there are other benefits in terms of each, fiber and protein. Fiber also, as you know, in terms of helping with cholesterol levels, bowel regularity, and in terms of the bowel, everything we're learning about the gut microbiome, or the bacteria that live in our gut, the healthy gut bacteria of which are really flourishing in a pattern of eating that is high in fiber. And high in fiber eating patterns tend to reduce bacteria in our gut that can be inflammatory or problematic. Protein, as you might imagine, is very important in terms of muscle, particularly maintenance during weight loss. There is a just right balance in avoiding too much, but certainly avoiding too little, that we'll discuss, but it is a critical required nutrient, particularly the amino acids, 20 of which or so that make up protein, that are essential, and we cannot make them, we have to eat them. And that's really important during healthy weight reduction, to maintain muscle as much as possible while losing body fat. Not all of you may be interested in weight loss as part of this Diabetes Prevention Masterclass, but even if it was an issue of gaining muscle, protein still becomes important to find the balance between avoiding too little and too much. So here is the triad, in this case in the sense of a triangle with the added bonus of the hunger scale, that I want you to think about. In terms of low calorie density, which we've discussed, that's the calories per bite of food, essentially, relating the calories to the weight, knowing that we need a certain weight of food per day to get us full, averaging around 4 pounds per day. Everyone's a little bit different, so maybe less, maybe more, but it's very difficult to change that dramatically versus the fact that foods have anywhere from less than 100 calories per pound to 4,000 calories per pound. And if I was going to put that into grams, because gram weight of food you will see on virtually all food labels and nutrition facts, foods range from less than 1 calorie per gram all the way to the highest, which is fats at 9 calorie per gram, which we'll discuss more in the fats lesson. So calorie density related to low calorie density, having high water content, think fruits and vegetables and foods that are cooked in water, and relatively low fat content, as well as fiber, have the least calories per bite. Fiber, therefore, can help a bit with getting full on less calories, but as you see in the left part of the triangle, really what we're talking about with protein and fibers help keep us full. Not to mention all the other benefits, but to keep us full. Protein does that as well, particularly when we get the right amount, quality, and timing. If you add those two factors together, if we were to combine protein and fiber as one in terms of keeping full, and calorie density as another of the two for getting full on less calories, and you combine that with the hunger scale that we've discussed of making sure to eat when you're hungry, learning the signs of early hunger before it gets out of control and turns into hunger dragon, and then stopping when comfortably full as often as reasonably possible. You really have found a magic blend of controlling calories with the least, if any, hunger, certainly unnecessary hunger possible. Very important to get this simple, ultimately, concept together. Calorie density for getting full, protein and fiber, the right sources for staying full, and then the hunger scale in terms of avoiding excess either hunger or excess stuff. So don't starve, don't stuff. Okay. We've gotten all the basics we need. If someone wanted to end the lesson right now, I suppose you could. But now we're going to start just delving a little deeper. So let's try to take a moment, prepare ourselves to consider a few added concepts to reinforce what we've discussed. Carbohydrate calories, and particularly fat calories, can be stored. Essentially, protein cannot. So in terms of timing, protein is like something the auto industry discussed some time back, just on time delivery. You don't want too little, you don't want too much, you want it to be delivered just on time. Usually that means at least 2 and many times 3 doses, or sometimes maybe more, let's say 4 per day. Not talking about the sources yet, for which we'll discuss a great plant predominant source and approach in terms of leveraging beans, lentils, and peas, but let's just say protein, and many of you hopefully will be thinking a lot of the healthy options that we have been discussing already, whether animal or plant-based. Spreading it throughout the day, not too much, not too little, largely based on, of course, when you're hungry and stopping when comfortably full. But not enough. Remember, muscle loss leads to insulin resistance. Too much protein, you can actually make the existing muscle you have insulin resistant. Either way, we want to find a balance. We don't need to obsess over it, but it's important to know. Risky types of protein sources we'll talk in a little bit might aggravate insulin resistance, and we're largely talking about fatty red meat. Okay, so just to be clear, we're talking about ideally, since protein cannot be stored in our bodies, having quality sources spread throughout the day, largely based on your hunger scale. Just on time delivery is the key thought there. Now, we've talked about protein in the abstract enough. Let's talk about real foods. There's a real shifting thought in nutrition education for the public that we shouldn't focus so much on micronutrients and macronutrients and all that stuff and just talk about really whole foods. I largely ascribe to that, but this is a master class, and I think we can actually walk and chew gum at the same time. So I was interested in making sure you knew some deeper concepts in the science rather than just having me tell you what to do. Why, I think, is a very important reason. Beyond the why in Mind Matters, really the why of understanding is also motivational. Recently we have, as part of, for instance, the True Health Initiative that I'm part of, argued that the best sources of protein really can't just be considered based on how concentrated in protein they are, but also in terms of the overall health effects that protein sources have. For instance, fatty red meat would have more protein and not much more, to be honest with you, per bite than beans and lentils, but the risks, all of the extra calories, the cholesterol, the saturated fat, it doesn't make it a better source than legumes or beans and lentils and peas. Therefore, we need to consider the whole picture because we're talking about health. So the highest quality protein source I'm really going to emphasize, and I don't expect many of you to just rely on this. We realize we're not trying to advocate for a full vegan approach to living, but the idea to increase protein from plant sources, the most significant source of which in terms of overall health and amount are going to be beans, lentils, and peas. I want to emphasize here that there are a lot of myths surrounding the beans, lentils, and peas group, particularly when it comes to soy and breast cancer risk. That has been debunked readily In fact, if anything, healthy sources of soy like soybeans or edamame, tofu and so forth are associated with lower breast cancer risk. And those original studies based on animal models, as often happens, don't pan out in humans at all. In terms of animal-based sources, the cleanest per se sources are those that are going to have some type of calorie balance, as you'll learn, low in saturated fat, and cholesterol as much as reasonably possible, and have other health benefits that would outweigh any risk that is minor in terms of cholesterol and saturated fat. So in terms of non-flesh sources, egg whites, there's a lot of controversy over the egg yolk. It's really not that controversial. The bottom line is because egg yolks are so concentrated in cholesterol, it tends to balance out the potential benefits, not to mention also relatively high in calorie density. So being high in calories and cholesterol and all of the compounds you hear about in the egg yolk that can be achieved through colorful vegetables is a better way to get those. For instance, an egg white omelet with lots of colorful vegetables will get you all of the zeaxanthin and lutein and the antioxidants that people claim are such a high benefit from egg yolks, but really aren't nearly that great compared to the risk in terms of cholesterol particularly, but even calories. It doesn't mean an occasional egg yolk's an issue, but I want to make clear why we're saying egg whites here. Non-fat yogurts are part of both heart disease reversal programs approved by Medicare, the Ornish program, and for full disclosure, the Pritikin Intensive Cardiac Rehab program, which I am an educator for. And even quality meal replacement shakes. Remember, we're not talking about thin liquid beverage calories based on sugar and fat and alcohol, but certain thick meal replacement shakes that have been shown through evidence-based studies, controlled studies of weight loss and managing hunger, are also a very reasonable source. Over-relying on them, the problem is, of course, is unrealistic, becomes boring. When it comes to flesh, fish is the flesh of choice. Bottom line overall. Of course, there are extreme ends, those that are very high in mercury, like shark and tilefish and swordfish, and even albacore tuna to some degree, although those are more concerns in terms of pregnant or wishing to become pregnant and breastfeeding women and children. In terms of humans, adult non-pregnant humans, it would not be nearly the concern. But then again, for sustainability and even for mercury, the most sustainable types of fish are going to be small fish, feeder fish, such as sardines. That being said, there's a nice resource that Seafood Watch or the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which actually developed the Seafood Watch app. So seafoodwatch.org is a website. You can look up the information, or you can download the Seafood Watch app and actually look up sustainable fish sources. Could be helpful for you. Obviously, the best overall thing for sustainability is to just reduce the overall amount of flesh, which is the biggest step forward we can make. And then, of course, there's shellfish. So beyond fin fish or shellfish, breast of poultry, pork tenderloin, and select lean cuts of red meat on occasion. I have to emphasize that pork tenderloin and poultry products, even when fresh, are frequently salt injected, particularly pork tenderloin. So even though it looks like it's not a cured meat and you're not getting it from the deli, you do need to pay attention, as there frequently is a nutrition facts label, and know that any land animal meat that has been unadulterated with salt should have less than 100 milligrams or only double-digit sodium levels for any standard 4-ounce serving. That's a quick and simple way to identify whether a land animal meat, particularly poultry or pork tenderloin, has been salt injected. There are some misconceptions, and I empathize with those that are shooting for plant predominant and particularly plant pure approaches to addressing the protein issue. But the truth is that nuts and whole grains are not really substantial sources of protein. What they are healthy sources of fat in terms of nuts and seeds, with some protein, not necessarily a lot. It's a little small player. Not going to say it's zero, but it's a supporting actor compared to healthy fats, usually is what you'll get from nuts and seeds. And then whole grains, being high in fiber, are a healthy source of carbohydrate. We have to differentiate refined carbohydrates from minimally processed and unrefined carbohydrates. Simple way to think of that is you can't compare a garbanzo bean or a navy bean to a jelly bean. Both are carbohydrates. They have totally different metabolic effects on the body due to calorie density, potassium, fiber, and so forth. Also, vegetables are commonly discussed as a high protein source. And vegetables are wonderful, colorful vegetables, green leafies, don't get me wrong, cruciferous vegetables. The problem there, of course, is their benefit in terms of calorie density is that you can eat so much for so few calories, but protein's a calorie, and therefore you have to eat unrealistically massive volumes of colorful or cruciferous vegetables to get an equivalent amount of protein, for instance, as a small amount of, in this case, whitefish. So 1.5 pounds of broccoli to get 21 grams of protein. Give it a try. I'm all for giving it a try. I wish we would have more food eating contests that were broccoli eating than hot dogs, but nevertheless, still 1.5 pounds is a lot versus just 3 ounces of whitefish. And so therefore you can imagine having a small amount of fish and then lots of vegetables as a nice fuel mixture per se in terms of picturing a meal. All right, so these are some equivalent protein sources. They're all about 20 to 35 grams, which we would consider a reasonable protein dose for most people. We're not talking about bodybuilders or extreme athletes here, so we're presuming that 20 to 35 grams per serving of protein, not flesh. You might take you 4 ounces of chicken breast to get this amount of, for instance, protein, but remember most of, for instance, chicken breast is water. So when I say protein, I'm being very literal. I'm not talking about flesh. A lot of people say protein, and that equivalent, that to them, they think that means the flesh itself. The flesh itself is mostly water, assuming it's not dried out beef jerky, and then a smaller fraction comes from actual protein itself. So 4 ounces of lean fish you see there having approximately 30 grams of protein. All of these are in the 90 to 150 calorie range, except for where you see in parentheses. In fatty fish, you'd get about the same protein, a little bit more calories, but in that case, it's from healthy fat that the extra calories come from, called omega-3, for instance, largely. There's a half cup of beans, legumes, anywhere from 8 to 16 grams. Particularly lentils are higher in protein and soybeans, but basically beans, lentils, and peas are really solid sources of protein, relatively speaking. And particularly when complementing a animal light approach can really find you the best so-called bang for your buck when it comes to protein for health and making sure that you're having enough protein to keep you sustainably full and maintain muscle mass. And you see the rest there in front of you to review. You can pause and take a look. Do notice that in terms of quinoa on the bottom right being a so-called high protein grain, relatively to grains, but to get only 8 grams of protein, you would need to eat 220 calories. Now, it is a whole intact food, so we might be able to take 10, 20% of those calories off that wouldn't be absorbed, which we'll talk about some more, particularly in the fats lesson, but nevertheless, you could see the reality check here when it comes to protein. Medical meal replacement shakes are typically between 15 to 25 grams per shake. They try to, as a meal replacement, replace a typical amount of healthy protein, whether in the form of beans, lentils, and peas, or animal, or a blend of the two, beans, lentils, and peas, with a smaller amount. For instance, a couple ounces of chicken, or cutting back on beef with a couple ounces by mixing it with some beans to find that nice balance. So, we talked about too little protein, now we're going to talk about too much. As I said again, everything we really needed to know is in the beginning of this lesson, and we're just digging a little deeper. What are some examples of where we can get into trouble with too much protein, particularly animal-based proteins, and especially red meat? There are some new understandings I want you to know of. You're in a master class. So in terms of heart disease, beyond being a source of saturated fat and cholesterol in terms of fatty red meat, not to mention higher calories because of the high fat content, there is a particular compound called carnitine in red meat that gets converted, as does lecithin in egg yolks, that gets converted into a compound called TMAO in a process that is beyond necessarily what we need to discuss, but makes the arteries more susceptible to cholesterol deposits. So it's not just the calories, not just the saturated fat, not just the cholesterol, but the TMAO, which you can look up. You could even probably Google TMAO New York Times. They did have at least two nice articles, not that I can vouch for the New York Times all the time, but two nice articles on TMAO as it relates to lecithin in egg yolks. Another reason to be focused more on egg whites and the yolk as an occasional, and as far as carnitine in red meat. Additionally, too much protein can increase the uric acid level in our blood. And to make a long story short, too much uric acid can increase the risk of gout and kidney stones. More than we need for protein can also potentially stimulate cancer growth. None of this is, of course, for instance, comparable to smoking and just, for instance, lack of physical activity and excess calories in general, but I want you to know about these things. So not to freak out about, but just to keep in mind. And then last but not least, another issue with fatty red meat is the high iron content for many, not all, because some of us need iron. There's better ways to get it, I would argue, than fatty red meat. But the concept that many, particularly older men and women beyond the menopause, are no longer losing blood every month and therefore losing iron every month, but at risk for building up iron. Iron builds up in the body very easily, doesn't leave very easily. Excess iron can increase the risk of insulin resistance in the liver and diabetes risk. Now, I think this slide really reinforces what we've already discussed. Over time, again, too little protein intake over extensive periods of time can cause slow muscle loss to a point that we can even become in a condition called sarcopenia. Sarcopenia just means such dramatic muscle loss that there are major health consequences. That can mean increased risk of heart attack, stroke, cancer, and dementia. So, reinforcing the point, resistance training, enough protein, not too much, and boom, you've got a nice blend. And then, of course, we know already about the appetite aggravation that might occur from inadequate intake of proper protein sources, particularly when trying to cut back on calories. Now, to keep this realistic, we're not talking about every single time we eat having to have a high protein source. Protein is not stored long term, but after we eat, there's plenty of protein circulating for several hours, so that if you felt like you just wanted to snack on some vegetables or some whole fruit or even some portion-controlled amount of nuts or what have you, that's fine. We don't need to have protein at every single feeding. We can't store it long term, but there is enough circulating in our system so that we can be rest assured that healthy snacks in between meals, for instance, and in fact every single meal, does not need to have high protein. But we do want to overall in our life have nice protein distribution throughout the day. It typically means at least 2, maybe 3 decent servings, and for me it's typically at least that per day. But strength training is the #1 priority to maintain muscle mass. Protein would be priority number 2, and not a dramatic number 2, but definitely significant number 2 compared to strength training. Now, as we progress into the partnership of fiber and protein, we're going to start off discussing fiber with a simple goal. The U.S. dietary guidelines would say that about 1.5 grams of fiber, and we're going to talk about real fiber versus processed fiber, for every 100 calories, 1.5 grams for every 100 calories would be good. We would argue that you really should shoot for 2 grams for every 100 calories overall, and 3 grams, at least on some days, if not regularly, would be really solid, excellent. For instance, ancient humans are estimated to have taken in maybe even up to 10 grams of fiber for every 100 calories. But since we don't have a time machine to take us back to Paleolithic times, that's not going to happen. And what is fiber? It's starch. It's a starch that we cannot digest as humans, but there are bacteria in our gut that love the starch of fiber to digest and can make into very healthy compounds that keep and feed our gut lining and actually can be absorbed to some degree to help reduce appetite. So-called short-chain fatty acids that gut bacteria can break fiber into that help us feel full and should say stay full on less calories. So we've emphasized this quite a bit. let me now just merge us into a concept that we will give you for label reading to understand how to know whether a meal has really hit a nice balance of protein and fiber called PF10. We've already mentioned all of this, except for now I'm emphasizing again, we're talking about protein and fiber together now, and legumes again stand out, beans, lentils, and peas, as a food that can combine both very well and achieve what you will learn about the PF10, protein and fiber, and you'll understand what the 10 means, that PF10 criteria in and of themselves. They're also, again, great fiber sources, not just protein sources. Of course, vegetables, great fiber sources. You see all the colorful and cruciferous vegetables there. Potato, not to be demonized, but a potato, while a so-called starchy vegetable, is so high in water content, it's only really moderate in starch, certainly compared to crackers and bread, which are very dry and carbohydrate and calorie packed. A potato with skin, plain baked potato with skin, cannot be compared to a French fry or a potato chip, which has been dried out, and if it's a fried potato chip, not only dried out from a 0-calorie nutrition source, water, but that liquid replaced water with oil, which is the highest calorie density source of nutrition. So a lot of times baked potatoes get maligned with guilt by association because of the processed versions of them that are completely different nutritionally, and specifically French fries and potato chips. We said we like to look at food, not just macronutrients and all of this detailed information, because at the end of the day, that stuff just needs to be there in the back of your mind, and then you want to be able to visualize what does this look like. So we're going to plant some seeds, no pun intended, in that regard here. And being very realistic, you see a picture in the upper left that was from a doctor's lounge at a hospital that I worked at. Large salad, you see some chickpeas in there in the center, and then you see some chicken noodle soup, which I portion controlled due to the sodium, but that's just a practical scenario. Life is fast. What can you do in a real world setting? You'd be surprised. Even in the top middle at Wendy's, if you know what you're doing, that specifically, they have a plain baked potato there with a grilled chicken breast sandwich, which I ordered without salt, and extra lettuce, extra tomato, extra onion. I skipped the bun. My non-negotiable was the ketchup with some water, and even on the run, you'd be surprised what you can pull off even in a fast food setting. All the way to a salad bar at Whole Foods, in which you see a mix. That chicken breast, that whole salad was actually 2 separate meals. It was so huge. We've got tofu, the edamame that you see in there, and the chicken breast. Again, that was such a nice, large meal. I actually ate most of the salad, but only half the chicken breast, because that's too large of a serving for one meal, and saved it for later. You see the minestrone soup with the peas. You also see, of course, in the bottom right, a simple, quick mix of some Amy's light in sodium chunky tomato bisque soup with some no salt added garbanzo beans and some even quickly microwaved brown rice, all mixed together in a wonderful, quick concoction that was very warm and satisfying and simple to do. More fiber sources. So we've talked about vegetables, we've talked about legumes, whole fruits, phenomenal, particularly some of them that really stand out. The berries, pears and apples, all citrus. I know you see orange on there, but basically citrus fruits and stone fruits I want to emphasize, as far as plums and apricots and peaches, even cherries. Avocado is technically a stone fruit, but since it is mostly fat for calories, but still has high water, it doesn't end up as low calorie or high. It's blended because of the water that brings down the calories, the fat brings it up. It's a medium calorie fruit. It's also not your typical fruit thought because it's not sweet, but I want to emphasize that. Dried figs, dried fruit, I wanted to put them in there because I don't want people to confuse, despite having equal calorie density, dried fruit and jelly beans. Just like you can't compare navy bean to jelly bean, and really can't compare beans and jelly beans, or real food beans and jelly beans. Even dried fruit and jelly beans, even though they have the same calorie density, the benefits in terms of fiber and potassium and antioxidants from dried fruit make it really completely different than a jelly bean. Because this isn't all about calories, it's about quantity of calories, it's about quality of calories as well. And last but not least, since we do live in amber waves of grain, whole grains. Yep, even air pop popcorn would be considered a good, if not great, but a good 2 gram per every 100 calorie threshold whole grain. spaghetti, whole wheat spaghetti, barley. Maybe not a lot of people are into barley, but you can even make it into a good breakfast alternative versus oatmeal. Bran flakes, yes, maybe more calorie dense, but we all need a little bit of crunch, and I'm a cereal guy. Happy to discuss cereals when we get into the breakfast options in any one of our live sessions. Even corn, which is a grain, cooked corn is high in water and is a good fiber source. Can't compare corn on the cob or no salt added corn even from a can compared to a corn chip or corn flakes. Another benefit that we want to discuss and cannot leave this lesson without addressing is that the more that you can lean towards, without being extremist, but the more you can lean towards fiber sources from plants in their intact form. Okay? Let me give you an example. Whole fruit versus apple sauce, whole apple versus apple sauce. A steel cut oatmeal versus a pulverized version of oatmeal in terms of Cheerios, which is 100% whole grain, but it's pulverized. Whole nut versus nut butter. A whole lentil soup versus a crushed lentil soup. When you eat the plant whole, you will unlikely absorb all of the calories. And in fact, in terms of nuts, we have a really good evidence you don't absorb all of the calories. You, for instance, with whole almonds, absorb 75% of the calories you see on the label. With an almond butter or nut butter, you will absorb all of the calories because it has been pulverized in a way that the calories are far more absorbable, to make a long story short. All those nooks and crannies of where calories are stuck in a whole plant food, our digestive enzymes can't get to them and they pass through us. So you get a real discount when you're calorie discount when you're eating whole food, intact plants. That's a benefit that I want you to know about. So again, now I've mentioned a number. Many of you track. You look online at nutritiondata.com. You go to a restaurant's nutrition online. You log things in your Lose It app or Chronometer or what have you, any of them, and you're able to see the fiber content and compare it to the calories. Well, we just showed you, and in fact, if you're looking at a breakfast that you see pictured here, this is from the Lose It app, you can compare the 400 calories, and I like to round, just make it simple, 400 calories to 10 grams of fiber. Well, that is clearly at least 2 grams of fiber for every 100 calories. That 400 calories, right, at 400 calories, 2 grams for every 100 calories would mean hitting 8 grams of fiber would make it good per our criteria. And it's even pushing close to great, which would be 3 grams. That would require 12 grams of fiber for 400 calories. But it's not difficult to know that something's a good fiber source. It's really important to know this because as we get to the PF10 criteria, you can't meet the protein and fiber criteria we're going to talk about without meeting the fiber criteria first, because it has to be the blend, and making sure that you have at least 2 grams of fiber for every 100 calories is a great overall recommendation by itself, not to mention when we get to the protein part. So again, here we're looking at this is a frozen entree. It's not your usual maybe higher risk type that's got all types of sodium in it, which is another topic, but it is a easy, quick way to look at a whole meal. You see 230 calories there. It's about 200 calories, okay? At 2 grams for every 100 calories, we should be seeing 4. And if you want to say there's 230, we say maybe 5 grams of fiber to be a good fiber source. And there you see it's got 6. So you can quickly assess this is a good fiber source. Okay? We'll talk about processed added fibers, but you can trust me, this organic product did not have any. All right? Now let's talk about processed fibers. But sometimes you will see a number on the label that's just way too good to be true. It's just shockingly good and you wouldn't expect it. I mean, let's just, for instance, yogurts and ice creams that have fiber. These are blatant examples. But sometimes even with products you wouldn't expect, you see a number of for fiber that's just really high. I mean, way above 3 grams for every 100 calories. And you just wonder, what might be on the ingredients list that would be adding to this that's not a true intact fiber that's been processed and added? look on the ingredients list, and these are some very common words you might see somewhere in the ingredients list. These processed fibers, before I name them, don't really harm us, but the real risk is that we presume they provide as much benefit as intact fiber from whole foods that are unprocessed and a naturally occurring part of the food, not stripped from a food, pulverized into dust, and sprinkled on like magic dust, expecting us to have equivalent benefit as whole food intact-based fibers. They do not. The data is nowhere near clear on these compounds like polydextrose, maltodextrin, inulin, not to be confused with insulin. There's no S in inulin, which is otherwise called chicory root extract. The irony, of course, is we don't want you, food company, to extract the fiber from a food and then put it into something else, chicory root in this case. We want you to leave it there. Oligosaccharides, you might see them called prebiotic fiber. Oat, wheat, and corn fiber, that's a little confusing because oat, wheat, and corn bran, B-R-A-N, thumbs up. Oat, wheat, and corn fiber is the pulverized to dust stuff that sounds good but is really not anywhere near evidence-based for our health as real intact fiber like bran. And then resistant starch. So there's evolving data on these processed added starches, but the bottom line is when you see these, don't expect the same health benefits as what is coming from a whole food, a whole plant-based food. Now I think we're at a point where those of you that are numbers oriented and you do track and you do look on back of labels, you go to a website to look up a meal and you can actually see the protein and fiber grams there that you can rely on. Whether you're tracking on an app, whether you're looking up on a restaurant's nutrition website, you're going to nutritiondata.com, and remembering that this PF10 criteria that I'm about to give you that helps assess a food's power for staying full on less calories, as well as a quality control measure to make sure there isn't excess amounts of highly processed, low fiber carbs and fats, is really meant for whole meals or a whole day, not for every single individual component, but again, a whole meal or a whole day when we're looking at the PF10 criteria. It is really as simple, once you know that, as taking the fiber grams, the real fiber, right, we just discussed, and the protein grams and add them together. Remember, the fiber has to be at least 2 grams of fiber for every 100 calories, and once you're there, you simply look at the protein. In this case, we've got 22 grams of protein plus 8 grams of fiber as an example. You combine those together and multiply it by 10 to get your PF10. In this case, 22 plus 8 is 30, multiplied by 10 is 300. Now we're going to compare the calories compared to the PF10 for staying full. Before we compared the calories to the weight of food for getting full, and you remember that triangle, which we'll see again, we want to get both of these going together, and then all of a sudden you will find a nice, particularly when blended with the hunger scale, sweet spot, so to speak, where we can be full on the least amount of calories possible. So if you have a PF10 of 300, I would say that that meal shouldn't have any more than 400 calories. The PF10 should be at least 75% of the calories, or else it means that we are risking a high amount of low fiber carbs and fats. Because if the protein and fiber formula here, PF10 is that low, where are the calories coming from? Not from protein, not from high fiber sources, got to be coming from low fiber carbs and fats. This is just some visualization. You don't need a label. Eventually, you'll get the concept after you look up enough numbers, and you won't need to be doing PF10 on anything. You may not have to do PF10 on anything now. You've gotten plenty of information without this. This is really for the numbers-oriented people. So this is an egg white French toast. I call it Power French Toast that I make using Ezekiel 4-9 cinnamon raisin bread, which actually has some lentils in it. Okay? And then simply on a nonstick pan with a little pan butter flavored spray, pour in the egg whites, drop the bread in and flip it over quickly and immediately so that it doesn't cook into the egg whites without flipping it first, and then a little bit of sugar-free maple syrup and some blueberries. Phenomenal. It's just highly filling, very few calories, high water content in everything you see there except for the bread, which has high fiber content, but is diluted in terms of the water by having high water blueberries, high water egg whites, and of course in and of itself having a very solid fiber content. Even at fast food, you can look up nutrition, for instance, on the Panera Bread app. As you're modifying orders, you can see the numbers change. They provide you nutrition information there. This, though, doesn't even require a label because you can see what I've done here. With the oatmeal, I've cut out the Cinnamon Crunch topping, the sugar, the large dose of sugar, and just replaced it with a packet of Splenda. This is a perfect example of where a low, no-calorie sweetener makes sense. Take out sugar, add in a low to no-calorie sweetener, and don't change anything else. Remember, we can't order a Diet Coke and then rationalize to ourselves, well, now I can go from a small fry to a large fry as you've cut out 150 calories but then added 200 into the picture. That happens all too often. The egg white avocado sandwich at Panera. Again, simple. Extra egg whites, extra high water there, extra high water and fiber with the tomatoes and spinach and basil and cucumber and red onions. And then I cut out the white cheddar. If I already have avocado, I've got a healthier fat. I don't need the processed fat. And the salt and pepper that they add because it already has naturally occurring sodium in the egg whites, and they've got some in the sprouted grain bagel flat as well, which is a calorie-dense item, but reasonably high in fiber, especially for a fast food bread. But I don't want to deny looking at the label, so here's a quick way of looking at it, a quick example of looking at it. This is a healthier pizza that I found in the past, to make a long story short. Let's break it down quickly. We see it's got 210 calories, and to review calorie density, it's in the upper end of medium calorie density compared to 130 grams of food. So it's not high, but it's not low. It's in the medium zone, and it's on the higher end of medium calorie density. Therefore, as you'll see, we might recommend that we finish with some whole fruit or start with a salad to help moderate the calorie density, or maybe do both of those. But now let's take a look at the staying full. Protein plus fiber together. There's no processed fiber in here. There's a very, very high fiber whole grain crust that they utilized. 13 grams of protein is in there, but let's make sure that there's enough fiber to meet the fiber criteria. At 200 calories, 2 grams for every 100 calories, we would need at least 4 grams of fiber. Not only does it have the good, it meets the great criteria for fiber, which is 3 grams for every 100 calories, and even a little higher than that with 9 grams. So it clearly meets the fiber criteria, qualifies for potentially meeting the PF10 criteria. Now let's add the protein to it. 13 plus 9, add that together, that's 220, and multiply I should say that's 22, multiplied by 10 is 220. That's your PF10. That's your stay full number and product, so long as it's at least 75% of the calories, and in this case, it is absolutely so. In fact, it's basically equal to the calories. So this has a nice high PF10 compared to relatively low calorie content for staying full. Its only real issue is it's not so low in calorie density. Not high, not low. Adding a salad in with some fruit, and you find yourself in the world of pizza without taking any significant risk. So, take home now, as we're winding up on fiber and protein. We talked about balancing protein throughout the day for the most part. We don't need to do it with every snack, for instance, and every single meal to have high protein, but we really don't want to just have one meal per day that has a reasonable protein source. Since protein can't be stored, we need to spread it out throughout the day to prevent muscle loss and to manage hunger. We add in fiber, and remember, beans, lentils, and peas do it all at once, not expecting you to have that as your only protein source. Maybe some of you, as vegans, might have that as your only significant or higher concentration protein source, but at least in the world of thus plant-predominant flexitarians, trying to shift up the ratio of beans, lentils, and peas and down the ratio of animal-based protein sources, particularly flesh-based sources, would be a great way for health and for sustainability in terms of earth, and therefore we can find a nice balance. Now we blend that fiber and protein together, and using the PF10 criteria, you can at least judge when that's really the case for those of you that are number-oriented and tracking, and you've got a nice way of staying full on less calories. And last but not least, we talked about the power and benefit of eating the whole plant, whole fruit, whole vegetables, whole beans and lentils versus crushed forms, which doesn't mean don't ever have whatever, fill in the blank. We have a 5% fun zone. We've got reality meets science backing up our entire philosophy. But that being said, we cannot deny the fact that there is going to be a lesser absorption of calories from whole plant-based foods. And we gave the example of 75% of the calories on a label, for instance, for a whole nut being absorbed versus all of the calories when it's a nut butter. And last but not least, there's the triangle again, we promised, right? Focusing in on the protein and the fiber that we discussed today at the bottom, with calorie density for getting full on less calories, and just paying attention to your hunger scale. Trying as often as possible to eat when early hungry before it gets out of hand, and to stop when comfortably full. Being willing to stop and save whatever's left for later, from a meal to a piece of fruit that you're already full enough on, is a great, great way to blend and find calorie balance with little to any hunger, particularly toxic hunger. And I hope you enjoyed that lesson.